All right, everyone, we've got a really cool guest on today, Austin over at Dragon Trappers Lodge. Most of you probably following one page rules. You already know about Dragon Trappers Lodge, do a lot of cool stuff. Really cool to have him on, talk about some of the stuff he's got on. They just put out, you guys just put out your roadmap, so maybe we can get into that, as well as just talking about maybe some of the 3D printing and all that sort of going on. But before we get into that, just Austin, just tell us a little bit about yourself and wargaming, and how did you sort of find this interesting hobby?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Yeah, the way I got into wargaming, I got into D&D first and like board games and stuff like that. So I got into miniatures in general. And there was a Warhammer store right by my house, and that's where I'd go get a lot of paints and supplies when I needed stuff. And the models always looked really cool, but they're so freaking expensive at the Warhammer store. And I knew I was so sure. I was like, I don't think I could get any of my friends to play this with me because it's too expensive. But I found a really cool sort of proxy army of the Seraphon by Lost Kingdom Miniatures. And I was finally like, you know what? I'm just gonna like print my army instead. It'll be a lot cheaper, and I like these models a lot better than the official ones. And so I did that, and then I actually was able to convince some of my friends, and they went and spent all their money at the Warhammer store instead of. And yeah, we played a little bit. They, I think it ended up just being way too crunchy for them and price prohibitive. But I kept playing, and then I ended up transitioning to one page rules, and then I was able to start bringing some more of them back because it was just way more streamlined, and you could use whatever models you had, and that kind of just kept going from there. Then we started making models for one page rules compatible armies, and now there's tons of armies my friends can play. I was like, hey, come to the office and pick an army. You can play whatever you want. We already have it all painted up and everything. So
Oh, dude, that sounds so. And so there's a lot to unpack there. One, I want to get it sounds like so there's a big debate going on about Games Workshop about whether they bring in people to wargaming or whether they actually are a net negative to the hobby. In other words, they probably discourage. How do you feel about that? Do you think that they really bring in, or are they sort of keep more people out of the hobby? How do you kind of feel about Games Workshop's just their net effect on wargaming?
um I don't know. It's a good question because I
Because
mean,
you mentioned it, you specifically said you were like, oh, I got some friends in, but then you were like the cost and everything, but then you went to one page rules and it seemed to bring them back in. So yeah, I wanted to see, yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'm not sure because I mean, if you look at like the bigger scale of things like TV shows and the video games and stuff like that that they're working on for Warhammer, that sort of thing has a way bigger reach than a lot of these smaller games will ever have. But
Mhm.
does that actually translate into like more players in the player base and like more people actually playing the game on tabletop? I don't really know. Like, did Space Marines really bring in a bunch more people? Maybe I don't really have the numbers on that or know exactly. I don't know if it drives people away from the hobby as much as it drives people to like other alternatives to Warhammer.
Hmm.
Because like, for instance, if you're into wargaming or gaming in general, then just because one option is super expensive doesn't mean you're just going to quit the hobby altogether. I would think most people would just find another alternative or go somewhere else. But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that. But
It's an interesting,
um,
yeah, it's an interesting, and I hope what you said is true, which is that more people find Games Workshop and then they transition to, like you said, another game, one page rules here. Um, and that's going to be interesting because we do have I don't know if you follow the whole Henry Cavill. It seems like Games Workshop is moving forward and this is going. So it'd be interesting to sort of see, how that's going to pan out for the actual hobby. Um, so tell us, so you're sort of like the head creative over at Dragon Trappers Lodge. How did you? I think just a lot of people would look at that career and say, "Oh, that's so cool." Like, how did you sort of, was there a point when you said, "Oh, wait, I can make a career out of creating miniatures?" So how did that sort of come about?
well, my background is in concept art. So before I did this, I was a freelance concept artist. I worked on some animated TV shows. I worked for an animation studio, like a pretty small one, um, and just did like some various freelance stuff. And I was not good at it in the sense that I just did not like taking direction very much.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I just, especially if the person directing you is not a creative themselves, I just had a really hard time being like, man, I feel like all of your suggestions are making this like objectively worse. Like I was like, I was not in charge of this process, you know? Um, and I ended up starting teaching online courses on digital painting and concept art and stuff like that, and they were really successful. I made quite a bit of money from those, and they, kept making sales after I were no longer having to make courses, and so I was able to sort of have a lot of free time and a lot of money to put into Dragon Trappers Lodge. I was really into uh, tabletop RPGs and stuff like that, and really into creature design and creature anatomy and stuff like that. And I would see a lot of dragon models and think like, man, I could make such a better dragon mini if I was designing
Hmm.
models. And which now it's come a long way, but when I started, I feel like there was a lot of like really sort of dopey, kind of old school, kind of cartoony looking dragons that for me just like wasn't my style. I wanted more anatomically correct and just like more realistic looking dragons. And yeah, D&D was an expensive hobby. I was really into minis and terrain, and I was like, man, I need to figure out how to make this tax deductible. So
Yeah.
I started Dragon Trappers Lodge. I took a bunch of the money I'd made from selling painting courses, and I started the first month. I think the first month we only had three models in the release. It was like a carrot, like a trapper, a mount, and then the dragon. And I was like, okay, we'll start with this, and then each month we sort of added one more mini, and just kept expanding and growing. And now we're putting out like I don't even know, like
Yeah.
50 models a month across like all of our various offerings and stuff like that. So it's come a long way.
Yeah, and like I always think like Dragon Trappers Lodge, you guys are sort of, and so there's definitely a lot of people making 3D models, but I'd say a sizable amount of them are definitely sort of the reskins of maybe Games Workshop others. And nothing wrong with that. That's great. That's terrific. But you guys really just build armies which are just way out there, which like I think is like the creativity on a lot of your work. I know the recent stuff. I got to you have your champions of Critter Folk, and that kind of really spoke to me. I grew up on like I don't know if you read Wall from Brian
Mhm.
Jacques, so I
Yep.
grew up on that stuff, and like I love the idea of playing a Red Wall army sort of thing now. Um, but yeah, but then you'll also then make like the swamp ones, and then the dragon. So you did so where do you sort of get your inspiration? Because it's really, you guys are just doing stuff that's like way all over the place, but it's still awesome. Like, how do you kind of, yeah, how do you kind of get there, you know?
Yeah, I've always had a pretty eclectic taste of just like, yeah, everything from the critter folk to, these swamp guys. I'm just like, hey, I'm into it. This is all cool, like I can find a lot of inspiration and enjoyment in a lot of different themes and ideas and stuff. I mean, the critter folk is based pretty heavily on Redwall. I also read Redwall as a kid in fifth grade. My teacher read us the first book, and then I was hooked. I read pretty much all of them through up
Yeah.
through like sixth grade and I really liked him. And then all these years later, my son, he's 6 now, about to turn 7, and I started reading. I read him the first Redwall book. We'd read it every night, and he like loved it,
Oh,
and was
wow.
you should do like an army that's like Redwall, and I was like, okay. We actually first made a RPG set, and it was really popular. People really liked it, and people were like, can you make this an army?" And we're like, "Okay, sure." So I made an army, and I think it's been our most popular army so far, or if not, it's vying for the most popular here pretty soon. We sell a lot on our Etsy store. We sell physical models, or we ship them out and stuff. We sell a lot of Sparrow Riders and a lot of Mouse Protectors. So yeah, it seemed to resonate with people, and I also think we get a lot of comments from people because we have that army. We also have like our Farmamancer army, which is a little bit more
Mhm.
lighthearted, fun to like awaken vegetables and stuff like that, and like a evil farmer. And then we also have like our Ooze army, which is a bunch of like little slime guys, and our fairy petal coats army, which is courts, which is a bunch of fairies and stuff. And we've gotten a lot of comments from people who are like, "Hey, this allowed me to convince my wife or my girlfriend or,
Yeah.
someone who's typically not into this to play because there's something that caters to them instead of everything being like 100% grimdark all the time, which I like grimdark stuff too, but I think it's fun to have more whimsical or like lighthearted, imaginative themes that you don't see anywhere else. So I just I don't know. That's just I like to run the gamut, and the nice thing is we just started Dungeon Classics, which is sort of like a sister subscription that will focus more on just like straight line RPG products, straight out of the monster manual, and then gives us a little bit even more freedom. I mean, we've already done this throughout our history, but even more so Dungeon Classic or with Dragon Trapper's Lodge to be way more out there and creative and just be like, hey, if you want like your bread and butter, you don't want
Mhm.
anything too crazy, here's Dungeon Classics. If you want to see us like go crazy and just like go all over the board with like stuff we think is cool and interesting, here's Dragon Trapper's Lodge. So we can do Critter Folk. I think in October we released the Critter Folk as our army tier, and then our RPG tier was like body horror,
Mhm.
mutate like it's like complete opposite ends of the spectrum
Yeah,
as far
exactly, exactly. Yeah.
as like horrifying monstrosities, like mutated bodies, and then just like cute little mice and stuff like that. And honestly, that's how I like it. I feel like I don't get bored and it allows me to really, stretch myself creatively instead of having to really hone in on one theme. But some people might not like it because it's maybe too inconsistent for them. But we have a really strong fan base of people who really, really like what we do, and they seem to stick around for it no matter what theme we do. So.
Yeah, like I don't. I mean, I guess I could probably hunt down, but like you guys, I always think like because it's not just models. There's a lot of people who make these individual D&D models, and that's terrific. But armies, like you guys, I think are the guys, the eclectic army guys who you can go and you're like I said, you're not just getting a mouse character. No, you're getting an army, and that's really cool. I found you guys through because you're one of the co-partner creators, I think, of OPR, and I love that idea of creating or finding your custom armies and playing these and having that system in place that you could play an official army with a mouse guard army. Well, not mouse guard, but critter folk army. Although, I mean, mouse guard. I love that. Like, there's other stuff that's inspired by mouse guard roots and stuff like that. Um, is that sort of where you kind of so OPR you the two of your companies feel very much like you have the right idea, right? Which is this idea of play whatever you want, and here's a system, here's some models for it. Um, so one thing I want to kind of get into with your stuff, I know for 2024 for me, it seems like in 2023 I knew like one person who had a 3D printer. But in 2024, I now know like 10 people who have 3D printers. And this conversation has gone on before, but how how big of an impact do you eventually see 3D printing having on wargaming, in general, that's something that's been highly debated. What's your sort of take on that?
Um, Yeah, it's a good question. I think part of it is, well, I mean, Games Workshop seems to not be particularly fond of 3D printing, which is understandable. I think that's the wrong take. I think that eventually they're probably going to have to embrace it. And if they did that and found out a way to monetize that, would probably really change things because that's like a bulk of maybe not even a bulk, but it's a big part of the market. But there also is a ton of people who are just like, I'm 100% on board with this 3D printing thing. The models are way cheaper. I have way more control over what I want, and I can print exactly what I want and stuff like that. I would have said maybe like a year ago that like it'll probably still stay pretty small. I don't know how much of like a major impact we'll have, but after seeing the success of the Trench Crusade Kickstarter, I'm like, oh, never mind.
Yeah.
Maybe it's more disruptive than I thought because I mean, that seems like it's been extremely popular, and I've been seeing all like everywhere, all over YouTube, people making Trench Crusade videos and
Hmm.
armies and painting them up and stuff. So. Um, yeah, I hope it gets bigger, honestly, because I think the more people play with, the better. Where I live in Utah, there's actually a pretty decent one-page rules scene, and everybody in it prints their models.
Oh, that's great.
Um,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people with like proxied Warhammer models, armies that they printed. So where I'm at, it's very popular. There's a ton of people who are printing, and it's popular enough that there's like brick and mortar printer repair shops around where I live.
Oh,
So
wow.
I don't think that's the case in like most cities probably. So yeah, it seems like it's going up. I hope so anyways.
You know, you brought up Trench Crusade. So first of all, and you know, I'm working on Trench, and I have a friend, and I actually have some models I'm putting together that he has printed up. Literally grabbed 3 or 4 different 3D STLs and had him print it so I can kit bash some Trench Crusade. So that's the one thing that's pretty cool. The two thing, the fact that you've got Trench Crusade in your mind, we have to ask, is Dragon Trapper's Lodge going to give us something for Trench Crusade? Is that something that you're thinking? Because that would be cool. So,
I mean, I was looking, they said that they encourage people to make armies for it and stuff like that. I'd be open to it. We don't have anything on the horizon because we usually plan stuff out like pretty far in advance, right? So like Kickstarters are planned, we're already thinking about it and working on like 6 months in advance, right? Or Frontiers or whatever. But I'm totally open to it. It looks really, really cool. I feel like our brand might be too like fantasy because like there's
mhm.
this feel pretty grounded, but then again they have a bunch of demons and stuff, so like maybe not. I did feel when I saw it, I was like, oh man, our Children of the Flame army like kind of fits pretty close into this already. It's like sort of like fantasy, medieval, World War I vibes, with dragons. But I feel like the people who are into Trench Crusade might be like, that's like too fantasy.
Mhm.
Like dragon guys are maybe too fantasy, but um I'm not familiar enough with like the rules of stuff yet. Like I haven't really looked into it, but if we could make a rule set for Children of the Flame that works with Trench Crusade, we could do that for sure. That would be really cool. And it's certainly not off the table. So
That'd be pretty cool. That'd be pretty cool. Well, and I think like I don't know, like I think you're right. Like I think that Trench Crusade, it's definitely been the most popular where it's just been people come up with a concept, the STLs, and to get that much is that definitely is a sign that you're right. 5 or 10 years from now, where will Games Workshop be? Um, well, so you're right. So I know you've just released your roadmap. So on your Discord, you released your roadmap. Maybe tell us a little bit of some of the stuff that you have. So the first thing that jumped out to me that I saw on there was like you had some really dark fantasy stuff, and then like in the middle of it, you've got Food World. Maybe tell us. I just saw it on you. Can you give us a little hint about like Food World? I just want to. So what's going on? Yeah.
uh, yeah, so the way that we do our sets is we put it up for a vote. We come up with 4 options that we think would be fun to make any one of them, and we let patrons vote on what they want to see next. And there's a patron who has been suggesting like a food world theme for a long time, like a couple years, and I was always kind of like, I don't know, like. But they really were persistent, and I was like, let me think about it. Let me see if I could think of any cool ideas that we could do for Food World. And people would throw in suggestions that kind of help me see it a little better. I was like, okay, yeah, I could see that. We could do some fun stuff with that until eventually I was like, you know what, let's throw it up there. Let's see how it goes. And people voted for it. They wanted to see Food World, and so they're like, all right, let's do it. So it's basically going to be a set of like adventure chefs. So like think like one of them that we came up with is like a bake barbarian. She's like a baker barbarian with like a massive rolling pin that she used to,
A
beat
big.
monsters. Have a paladin, which is like a paladin, like a paladin, right? And got like a big cleaver and like a big spatula or something like that. And he's like a knight with like a big chef hat and stuff like that, and like an apron. And then like a sushi chef, sort of samurai type guy with like some
Oh,
chopsticks
wow.
and stuff. And then the last one was can't remember off the top of my head. But basically, it's going to be sort of like a bunch of food themed monsters, like a ice cream triceratops or a
Yeah,
bread
yeah, yeah. Oh.
like that sort of stuff, right? And these guys just like hunt these food monsters and cook them, and they're just like these like high level like extreme chefs that are just like we go out, we find these food monsters, we kill them. I don't know. Well, we're working on the lore still. I don't know if we're just gonna. This slots into the monsters of the multiverse sort of category where it's like somewhere out there there's a dimension of all food monsters, or if we're gonna have it be like a wizard spell gone wrong and like these creations all just get created on accident from food or something like that. We're still working out the lore aspect of it, but yeah, that's where food came from. In fact, now that we're actually starting it, I feel like we had so many ideas that we're like, okay, we're gonna have to like cut some of these and maybe do a part 2. So I already have a part 2 in mind that's like Food World candy version where it's like everything is just candy themed because there's so
Hmm.
many ideas you can do with just candy, but I didn't want to just that's not quite what we pitched the set as is like a candy themed set. So I was like, let's just save all the candy stuff for potential part two if people like this one, and then we could do Food World Candy Edition and have all the, licorice and candy canes and whatever stuff, those guys. So it's gonna be a fun one. I'm excited about it. I think people will like it. We got a
Yeah,
sushi I'm excited about the sushi dragon. It's like the big giant sushi roll with like a dragon head and stuff.
yeah, well, I love that. Like, I just because you read because you've got like Rage of the Elementals and Kingdom. It's like you said, like you mentioned, this stuff is all over the place. I know I've done some coverage because I really enjoyed your Fiends, I've been Conjurax and your Dragons. So, but how much does lore do you come up with your lore first, or is the visuals? In other words, are you a person that sees a really interesting model and sort of develops lore, or do you think about the lore first and that sort of brings it all together into, well, I shouldn't say yourself, but your team, right? Because it's really a team of you guys now. Yeah.
I'd say it's sort of both at the same time. I don't think you can really distill it down to like this first and then this. It's like you they kind of reflect off of each other. So, like for example, right now the army we're working on next this month is releasing the last part of our Cult of the Pale One, and then next month will be Heralds of the Apocalypse, and the theme of that is basically, this big bad evil demon dragon in Kandrox has escaped from his imprisonment. He's going to basically destroy everything. He's like the main bad guy, and the angels were the ones who are supposed to be responsible for trying to like, keep him imprisoned, and they feel that they failed now, and that the things they tried before to imprison him aren't going to work a second time. And so, because of this failure, a group of them have come to the conclusion that their only option now is to just usher in the apocalypse and have the cycle of life start anew, have the world be like cleansed completely from ground zero. And that's like the best, most merciful thing they can do. So they're like these hosts of angels that are just bringing destruction and end times to the world as in their mind almost like an act of mercy, right? Like they're just thrown in the towel.
Oh,
We
that's
can't win. It's going
interesting.
to be impossible. So let's just accelerate, the apocalypse sort of. And so for that, we have the lore beforehand, right? We have this idea of what the army is going to be. We have a few characters that we've explored in the lore before as well. And the fun thing about the RPG side and the war game side is for us to all take place in the same world. So
Hmm.
sometimes we have in the RPG side individual characters that make an appearance in armies, and it's like lore consistent. Like you got to see in the RPG set what led up to that army being formed, or like how they ended up getting involved in the war on a larger scale. And so with this one, we had a couple of those, but then as we design the models, a concept artist might come with like a really cool design or a really cool idea, and we're like, oh, that looks super cool. Let's figure out how to add that into the lore. And so they kind of inform each other. They sort of go back and forth. And it's like that with pretty much everything we design, where we have an idea, but also the lore also gets sort of fleshed out as we get, models to fill in the story and stuff like that. So I think it's hard to say it's just like one, this comes first
Hmm.
than this. It's just like a
No,
big process.
yeah, you mentioned this consistent universe. Does everything stay within the universe? Like, is Food World going to exist in the Fiends of Intractate world, or how? Like, because I know that you've got the Fiends and then the Fey Petal Courts and a few of the comic over there. So how does that?
Yeah. Things like the critter folk or like the farmermancer and stuff like that. The way that we've sort of like canonized the lore is because like some of that stuff does feel like a bit of a stretch to push all together and be like, well, this
Mm,
seems like really kind of a little silly and like whimsical, and this seems like pretty serious. And we wanted to maintain the tone of the lore for the Dragon's War, which is our big like war game
mm,
story arc, right? And so the way that we sort of justified it is we have sort of three eras for the war game story arc. There's like the Dragon's War, which is sort of like the more gritty, serious, like, what's happening in the canon story. And then we plan to have one that will be sort of like more primordial, like think like primitive, 10,000 BC vibes, right? Where there's like no firearms. It's much more brutalistic. And we have some armies kind of for that, but we want to flesh that out more. And then the third one is what we call Whimsy Wars, which in the lore is essentially an in-world war game that like wizards and mages play, where their little miniatures sort of come to life, and
oh,
magically, and they play it in game, right? And and that's the lore for it. And they will use, figures from in-world storybooks or previous battles. And so Whimsy Wars is where like the critter folk come from. So
Oh,
like the
that's interesting.
Critter Folk are like a series of storybooks in our world that, some wizards have, taken the models and been like, here's Whimsy Wars. And then along with that, that also allows us to say, okay, so what's the justification for like if you played Critter Folk versus Fiends of Incandrox? Well, some wizard was just like, hey, Incandrox was like a historical figure. I made a Whimsy Wars army of Incandrox and his fiends. And so now these wizards are just all coming together, with their to play war games just like the rest of us are. So the Whimsy Wars stuff is sort of like in universe fiction,
Hmm.
and then the Dragon's War is sort of like this is like the canon events that happened, sort of. That's the
Well,
idea.
man, that sounds super cool. It sounds super. I mean, yeah, and I think that's really cool that you guys do lean so much into the lore, and that it feels there is this sense, that everything feels sort of connected. Well, cool. Well, cool. So you've got your. We know you have your roadmap out. Maybe just give some people who don't check out the roadmap, maybe give us a quick peep in the next couple of months about what Dragon Trappers Lodge. We've mentioned Food World. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll give you what's on the roadmap, and I'll give you one extra bonus that's not on the roadmap yet.
Ooh.
That's coming out would that be April or May probably? I think May. So yeah, for the roadmap coming up, we have this month is the last part of Cult of the Pale One, which is sort of like, lizard folk worshiping an eldritch entity in the swamps that turns them all albino, and they're trying to sort of spread this, mutation to other people. Then there's the Heralds of the Apocalypse, so that'll be 3 parts. After that, we don't know what the next army will be yet because we haven't voted on it. It's still a little ways out. And then for the RPG side, we have this month is Tales from Frostwith Lodge, sort of like a tall tale, wintry, up in the mountains, sort of, legends of all these, one-off legendary monsters that live up in the mountains. Then we'll have Rage of the Elementals, um, Food World, and then Journey to the Kingdom of the Sun, which is like sort of African savanna themed.
Hmm.
We'll have we're doing a big, really big, the biggest one we've done, Frontier as well for Dungeon Classics, which is going to be 3 really popular starter adventures for Dungeons and Dragons. So Lost Mines of Fendelver, Dragons of Stormwreck Isle, and Dragon of Icespire Peak. And you'll be able to get every single mini for those campaigns in like big, huge bundles, including like unique monsters like Gorthok the Thunderbolt and like NPCs and stuff like that. It's gonna be like hundreds of minis where it's like this is every single model you need to run this entire campaign from
Oh,
beginning to
wow.
end, just ready to go for you. And so that's gonna be a big one. But the thing that I'm also really excited about that's coming out a few months after that will be another frontier for Dragon Trappers Lodge. There'll be another narrative campaign involving the Fiends of Incandrox versus Children of the Flame in the narrative. And it'll have new hero units for both armies. It'll have a new infantry unit for both armies. It'll have a new sort of monster unit for both armies, as well as like a full 6 to 8 mission narrative campaign that you can play through. That as well as like objective markers and stuff like that. 3 printable objective markers that are themed with each army. And I'm pretty excited about that one. It's gonna be a cool one. So.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So is this narrative campaign, um, do you see part of this narrative? So do you see this, in your lore, are you actually going to be advancing the lore a little bit, or is this more like how do you kind of? I want to kind of get your hot take on that. I'm getting some hot takes on you about lore. Do you like the idea of advancing your lore, or do you like the idea of keeping the lore not so advanced and letting the players? How do you kind of feel about that?
Yeah, I like the idea of advancing the lore, but also keeping a lot of empty space in the history where players can tell their own stories so
Yeah.
that the lore almost exists sort of like, all times at the same time, right? Instead of being like, here's where it is right now, it's like you can play at any point in the timeline and there's enough unknowns in the story that like there's plenty of room for you to play out the stories, but that eventually we have like here's how it eventually concludes. I feel like it's a little unsatisfying to just have it go on forever and never have it conclude, especially since we have some sets that are set after the Dragon's War.
Hmm.
Uh, as far as like the RPG stuff goes, and like almost more modernized era where we just barely released a set last month that's like sort of like 1920s Japan, and there's like a magical train and like so like Yakuza type guys, and we imagine this takes place a little like maybe 40 years after the Dragon's War finished, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
we have an idea that there's an end, but we try and we're developing the story, but we want to take our time. We don't want to just be like,
Yeah.
and it ended, here's how it goes. There's tons of stories to be told of like what happened during the Dragon's War and like what were the casualties and like what were the, twists and turns. So this will sort of explore some of the very beginning of the Dragon's War, because when Kandrox bursts out, the Children of the Flame are the very first ones to confront him, and right off the bat, and Kandrox is just like annihilating and destroying
Hmm.
everything. It's like looks really, really bleak. And not to give too many spoilers, but this will essentially tell the story of like how the tides turned, so that the people, the rest of the world facing off against Kandrox were able to even have a fighting chance to not just have this be wiped out in the first year, like they were able to pull something off where it's like, okay, now there's at least a fight on the table where we might win. It'll be really cool. It's the two main heroes are sort of one of them is sort of like this renegade, soldier who just kind of has a hard time following orders from the Children of the Flame, but he's
Hmm.
gets the job done really well, and so they have a hard time, punishing him. Type of guy like smoking a cigar and wearing like his tank like that vibe, right? Just like a real like badass. And then on the other side is the a defector from the Children of the Flame who wasn't captured and mutated by Incandrix, but willingly left because he was
Hmm.
like, the dragons, they just treat us like fodder. And, if I'm just going to be forced to sent to die, I'd rather choose my fate. I'd rather at least have the promise of like free will and power. And so, in spite of the Dragon Lords and his creation as just like a soldier to be thrown into the meat grinder, as he views it by the Children of the Flame, he voluntarily joins in Kandrox and has sort of this like spiteful vengeance for this sort of renegade guy, because he's like, you also see the problems with it, but you still stay. You're a hypocrite or whatever. You're part of the problem. While you know the
Hmm.
renegade sees him as like, hey, it might have its flaws, but you definitely took the wrong path. Like, choosing evil isn't the way. And that's sort of going to be the dichotomy of that story, where it's going to be sort of like a savory, like a very like Hail Mary vibe, where this renegade goes into behind enemy lines and is going to try and rescue some people that the Dragon Lords have decided were too risky. We can't rescue them. We have to cut them off as a loss. He's going to start off by leading a small squad and being like, nope, I'm going in after him. And then the bad guy's like, oh, we're not letting you leave with these people, and that's sort of like the story as it sets up. So it's gonna be really cool. I'm pretty excited about it.
That's cool. And I'll just end it saying that one of the things that I think that a lot of people pick up from Dragon Trappers Lodge, especially yourself and your team, is just passion. I think that's why your stuff comes out so well, is just the passion. So thanks a lot for your time. Anyone here, if you don't already know, which is probably not, check out Dragon Trappers Lodge. Austin, thank you so much for your time.
Appreciate it, Daniel. Thanks for having me on.
All right.